Today we're going to talk about the postmodern short story. As you see in the comic strip below, postmodernism can be kind of hard to define. What we have going on is a governor being asked questions on the TV screen, and if you notice, every time he gives an answer, it's really not much of an answer at all. It's almost like he's questioning rather than answering, and this has a lot to do with postmodernism. So to better understand this, let's first look at what a comedian might say about postmodernism.
In case you hadn't realized, it has somehow become uncool to sound like you know what you're talking about. Or believe strongly in what you're, saying. Invisible question marks and parenthetical you knows and you know what I'm sayings have been attaching themselves to the ends of our sentences, even when those sentences aren't, questions. Declarative sentences, so-called because they used to, declare things to be true, okay? As opposed to other things that are, totally, not. They've been infected by this tragically cool and totally hip interrogative tone. As if I'm saying, don't think I'm a nerd just because I've, noticed this, okay? I have nothing personally invested in my own opinions. I'm just, inviting you to join me on the bandwagon of my own uncertainty. What has happened to our conviction? Where are the limbs out on which we once walked? Have they been, chopped down with the rest of the rainforest? Or do we have, nothing to say? Has society just become so filled with these conflicting feelings of that we've just gotten to the point where we're the most aggressively inarticulate generation to come along since, a long time ago?
All right, so to better understand postmodernism, you kind of need to know what modernism is. Now, most of you have already read modernist authors. Some famous authors would include Fitzgerald in his Great Gatsby, or T.S. Eliot and the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And if you're not as familiar with those, you might have heard of William Faulkner, Robert Frost, Ernest Hemingway, James Joyce, Franz Kafka, or Pablo Neruda. Some characteristics of modernist texts would be, first off, the date. They tend to be early to mid-20th century, right around World War I. They show a break with traditional forms, and they tend to have a theme of decay in society and alienation, which means isolation, of the individual. And now a lot of this does relate back to World War I. If you remember from history class how World War I had a lot of death and a lot of devastation, and because of the new forms of warfare, people really weren't ready for what war was going to be, and they kind of felt very let down at the end about, hey, what were we fighting for anyways? Other modernist characteristics would be stream of consciousness writing, where you basically feel like you're in the narrator's head the whole time. It can be very confusing. Very complex language structures, and then a general emphasis on science and rationalism as the answer to man's problems. So no longer the values of the 19th century or any kind of religion, but instead more of the rationalist, I can think for myself the answer to my problems. Here's an example of a modernist work. This is just an excerpt of Prufrock. It says, "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights and one-night cheap hotels, and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent, to lead to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit." So if you can see from this poem, it's not exactly like the 19th century poems or earlier. This one has some pretty dark imagery, no real rhyme scheme. You have etherized patients and sawdust restaurants, and A love song? That seems like irony to me. I'm not sure what's very loving about this, but I don't really want to be on a walk with this guy. So just kind of sense this is what modernist literature looks like. So let's move on to defining postmodernism and see if some experts can help us understand it.
The first difficulty in defining postmodernism is that everybody gets a crack at it.
Well, postmodernism is what we have after modernism is over.
Modernism is really the worldview you associate with the rise of modern science,
People believed in progress.
the role of human reason.
Or the idea that reason will eventually be able to give us every answer to all ills.
In fact, it exalted reason to such a degree that it tended to put faith second.
Now, that's last century. In the 21st century, all of those kinds of modern thought have become old-fashioned.
If you think of modernism as symbolized by Tower of Babel trying to reach up and replace God, postmodernism is the Babel that came after that, when people lost the ability to communicate because there's no common language or presuppositions.
Having said that, I don't really think it's possible to define postmodernism.
Let me define postmodernism.
Let me give it a go.
And of course, there are many different ways of defining it.
It's an attitude towards truth claims.
A kind of suspicion of all absolute truth claims.
Truth claims are not what they seem to be. In fact, truth claims are attempts to control other people.
That's one way of defining postmodernity.
A recent French philosopher,
Jean-Francois Lyotard,
defined postmodernism as incredulity towards all meta-narratives.
an incredulity toward meta-narratives.
That's a mouthful, but basically what it means is a kind of skeptical attitude towards all claims of absolute truth.
Meta-narratives. Now, the actual word he uses in French really translates into English as big stories. There are all kinds of big stories. One kind of big story might be human beings, by way of human reason, are capable of knowing everything. Another big story is that by way of modern medicine, we are able to cure all ills. Those are just some big stories.
Postmodern would say there are many, many different stories.
Other people might talk about it in terms of the rejection of any one narrative, any one story. The fact that it is postmodern after a particular period suggests that it's still open to interpretation and still yet to be defined in many respects. You don't know if it is an actual period or transition to another period.
Postmodernism, or postmodernity, is all over the map. So you have all sorts of people who believe quite disparate things calling themselves postmoderns.
So you get fragmentation, people pulled in different directions, even the same person pulled in different directions.
Maybe there is no way we can find any kind of objective truth.
There isn't really anyone who is sort of able, certainly I'm not, to stand up and say, I am the arbiter of what postmodernism is.
Postmodernism is a kind of bastard offshoot of modernism. It's an illegitimate child that is constantly trying to kill its parents, but in one sense it still partakes of the same problem, namely the elevation of the individual and of the subgroup to the point where it is impossible for anybody to listen to God.
All right, so hopefully that helped you a little bit, but as you see, defining postmodernism, it's not that easy. Here's what Harry Kunzru says. He says, this is the essence of postmodernism, the idea that there is no essence, that we're moving through a world of signs and wonders where everything has been done before and is just lying around as cultural wreckage, waiting to be reused, combined in new and unusual ways. Nothing is direct, nothing is new, everything is already mediated. The real, whatever that might be, is unavailable. Sincerity is out, irony is in, and style. If modernism was about substance and serious design, solving problems, postmodernism was all manner and swagger and stance. And if you look at the picture there, I think it represents postmodernism really well. The idea that you are not yourself. You are not what you think, and there's always questions to be asked. So for our purposes, defining postmodernism will be as such. First of all, it happened post-World War II, and it's a worldwide literary movement, not just Latin America. Generally, the authors are analyzing and challenging the constructs on which society is based. They don't really believe in an absolute truth. Everything is subjective, which means it's based on the will of the individual or individual opinions. They reject social constructs that people tend to just assume to be true, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. They don't think the world's on the brink of disaster, which is what a modernist would say, but that it's already been destroyed and is beyond redemption, meaning, or understanding, and we're kind of just picking up the pieces and putting them back together. Here's some constructs that postmodernists tend to like to deconstruct in their works. First off, good versus evil. Makes pretty much sense, right? We all know what's good. We all know what's bad, right? Well, postmodernists say it's not always that simple to define what good and bad really are. Male versus female is a huge construct. Certain societies feel that these genders have roles, and you should perform your role based on whatever gender you were born as. But postmodernists are going to argue that maybe this isn't the case. High class versus low class is another very current postmodernist trend. If you look around the world or even within your own community, there's people who have money and people who don't. And that's just kind of the way things are, right? Rich people, poor people. Well, postmodernists kind of challenge us to think that maybe it shouldn't be that way or doesn't have to be that way. And lastly, power relations. Individual versus government. You're going to see this a lot in what we call dystopian literature, Fahrenheit 451, 1984, works where usually they're satirical as well, where the author is questioning really the role of governance in the lives of people and how much freedom, we really should have. The chart on this slide shows you some characteristics of modernism versus postmodernism. You don't need to memorize all of these, but it just kind of shows you in literature what postmodernism would look like. Things like anti-form, play and chance, that kind of means satire, like it seems like the author is kind of just playing around or trying to be funny. Anarchy, which means a lack of order. Absence and dispersal are also going to happen in these works. Now for us, we're going to look at two Latin American authors, but if you are aware of others, here's some other authors that are postmodern. They're Kurt Vonnegut, maybe you know Slaughterhouse, David Foster Wallace, and Jorge Luis Borges. Those are all some other postmodernist authors. We're going to look at two. Woman Hollering Creek, that is by the Mexican author Sandra Cisneros. And when you read this, you're going to see some postmodern characteristics, including broken narration. The way that she does quotations is not the way that you were taught to do them. I'll just say that. And it's kind of hard to follow, but once you understand it, it's going to really add to the story. Her whole deal is going to be rewriting a legend to challenge true social constructs. So we're going to talk about the actual legend, and then when you read the story, you'll see how she kind of redefines what particularly the woman's role in that legend is. The other story we'll look at is by Chilean author Isabel Allende. It's called Two Words, and this also has gender roles discussed. She is going to be very adept at challenging patriarchal hegemony. It's a big word, but all it means is men in charge. And especially in Latin American societies, the idea of patriarchy is somewhat a part of how they believe, or at least did, 50 years ago or so. So Allende is going to challenge that. She's also going to reclaim an archetype for women, and it's the act of seduction. Throughout literature and throughout history, women have sometimes been given a bad rap as being seductresses, being the ones who tempt men. They have to be controlled, men have to watch over them, and that kind of explains some of the poor treatment of women over history. However, Allende is going to take it all the way back to Adam and Eve and say that if women have this quality of seduction, this archetype of seductress, then maybe that can be used in a good way. Maybe there's an advantage to that, and that it's not all negative the way that history has shown it to be. And class and gender are also going to play a big role in Allende's work as well. So as you do this postmodern unit, just make sure that you pay attention, and I hope you enjoy it, but just whatever you do, when you get your test at the end, don't do what this kid did. So notice, one important event took place on December 16th of that year, and he doesn't even answer because he doesn't believe in linear time, and there's no past and future. The question is meaningless and impossible to answer. So like a postmodernist, he's going to defy terms and definitions. He's going to say there's no absolute truth, but in the end, hopefully we'll arrive at some kind of truth, or at least enough truth to do well on a postmodernist test. All right, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in class or give me an email, and I hope you enjoy the unit.